This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global MedTech community at mystrategist.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. I'm David Filmore, executive editor of Market Pathways. I wanted to give you a heads up on this episode before we got started. This is a first of a two-parter. So my colleague Steve Levin and I had a conversation recently about what we expect in the global MedTech regulatory, reimbursement, and policy realm for 2022. Tune into the next episode in a couple of weeks to hear what we have to say about Europe and Asia in that regard. But today's episode, we focus specifically on the U.S. policy picture in Congress, FDA, and CMS. So here's that conversation. Hope you enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the Market Pathways podcast. I'm David Filmore, executive editor of Market Pathways, and I'm here with my fearless leader, our editor-in-chief, Steve Levin. Steve, how are you?
Good, Dave. How are you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. It's good to be talking, Steve. We don't always get to do this. We're going to do something a little bit different on this episode of the podcast. Typically, we talk to leaders, experts in the MedTech community about important, regulatory reimbursement, policy issues impacting industry. But today, you and I, Steve and I, are going to chat so we could spotlight what we see as some of the most important kind of events or things to watch out for in the coming year in that sort of MedTech policy space. And this will be based on our reporting, Steve and I are doing and others with Market Pathways. So, you can kind of read more about anything we talk about today on mystrategist.com. But, let's try to get to this, Steve. I mean, I think the best, thinking about MedTech, it's kind of a global operation, obviously the MedTech industry, and our coverage is regulatory policies, obviously very global and reimbursement and the like. So I thought maybe we could, just do it by geography, kind of split this conversation to tackle in pieces in different parts of the world. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I think that while MedTech is still a U.S.-centric industry, the global aspects of it are just increasing every year. And so to focus on the US and then Europe and on Asia as well, I think is kind of the best way for us to cover the globe, and also reflects the coverage that we provide in Market Pathways. So Dave, let's start with the US. Again, seems like a logical place to start because for MedTech, US is really a home base in many ways. And in 2021, COVID issues dominated policy decisions at federal agencies, as well as, I think it's fair to say, distracting from other priorities. And of course, for industry, there was a major barrier in one non-COVID-19 priority, which was the Medicare coverage of innovative technology programs. And we're going to refer to that from now on as MCIT. For those of you out there, and MCIT is the acronym. And MCIT was finalized at the start of the year, only to be repealed before 2021 ended with the change of administration. So why don't we start, Dave, talking about what is the kind of the key context for U.S. MedTech policy development as we look ahead to 2022?
Right. Yeah, sure, Steve. Yeah, and you're right. Obviously, we've been sort of so COVID directed in policy. Certainly on the FDA side, it's just been everything has taken a back seat to sort of policies and emergency policies. But there have been some things to watch, particularly like you say, you mentioned the MCED and some other things that obviously brewing in terms of other things that have a broader impact on innovation beyond just this pandemic. So I think in 2022 that transition is going to be important out of some of those issues. But so in terms of key context, I mean, obviously, we're talking February 16th, big news out just this week. FDA just finally got a confirmed commissioner after more than a year, of having an acting Janet Woodcock in that position. So Robert Califf is now, pending a swearing in ceremony, the new commissioner of FDA. So that's going to be important, and we can talk more about that. But that's sort of a key bit to watch in terms of his impact. CMS, we can talk a little bit more about in terms of their thinking on MedTech evolving under this new Biden administration, with kind of how they look at MedTech and evidence. But I wanted to actually dig in first on sort of what to look for in Congress, because Congress, I think in 2022 is going to be a key venue for, what to look out for, because, typically a lot of talking happening in Congress, a lot of debates, not always a lot of action, particularly, you're not always looking for very important day-to-day substance for MedTech policy out of Congress. It's these big issues that don't always filter down. But 2022 is going to be an important year for things that are more substantive, because it is a user fee year, essentially. Every 5 years, the FDA user fee program needs to be reauthorized. And that user fee program kind of underlies some key funding for FDA and key commitments and policies and sort of how they go about their business for the next 5 years. So that's all going to be defined in this so-called, MDUFA 5 upcoming package. The current program expires September 30th. And that means by then, unless something really unusual happens, Congress is going to pass a bill that includes that, reauthorization for devices, for drugs, for biologics. And that's really important for FDA. And it could be, even beyond just that, it's an important thing to watch because it's a vehicle. It's a must-pass legislation that has a specific date associated with it. So then you got lawmakers, you got advocates looking at that as a target to make their own reforms, other big things related to FDA. So you have some things on the table like you could have comprehensive diagnostics reform. There's been a debate for years, and something called the VALID Act, which would really just completely change how FDA regulates diagnostics. And that's, type of thing that seems like a big lift, but it's been in the queue, and now we have this legislation, potentially could go through. You mentioned MSET, which we could talk more about in a little bit, but that's also something, Congress is talking about, as you said, CMS repealed that before it even got started, this automatic coverage pathway for breakthrough devices. But, 2022, look out for Congress, see what happens in, the potential for that to get pulled along by this user fee process. And so, and that's, combined with so much momentum around, pandemic and like reforms to improve our response to the pandemic. There's this Cures 2.0 legislation, which is a lot of reimbursement and FDA stuff that sort of is the sequel to the very popular, 21st Century Cures Act from 2016. So there's just so much momentum in Congress this year for getting things done that are related to MedTech. So, if you're going to pay attention to Capitol Hill MedTech policy, any year 2022 is the time to do it. And now we just need to wait, of course, for Congress to actually receive a user fee agreement from FDA and industry so they could, start on this work. So that's kind of where we are now, I would say.
So one thing, for those who've been following MDUFA, and hopefully people have been through the coverage and market pathways, is you've detailed the delays that have taken place in this process. Now, not all unexpected. Some of these delays have occurred previously. Talk a little bit about kind of where things stand. What are the next steps and implications of the delays that we've seen on the MDUFA 5 talks, and what the prospects are, for the rest of this year, given, as you said, there is this September deadline.
Right. So it's been a tough go for those, like I said, this is a process that happens every 5 years. And, sometimes it's easier than other times in terms of, how it happens is FDA and industry are put into a room to come up with a deal. And that really forms the core of what, Congress doesn't typically change what they put together. Just what they put together is kind of a core package that includes, user fee amount that industry has to pay, and the policies that FDA commits to in terms of how quickly they're going to review applications, guidance documents, other programs, transparency. So, that is what they've been talking about. And they've been talking about that in a sort of closed door negotiations for the past more than a year. And it's been clear from the start that they're sort of not in the same, starting from the same positions, and they're kind of far apart. And they remain far apart. I mean, as of, before Thanksgiving until over the holidays, until the new year, they really had a complete stall of not meeting at all. And now I think it seems as if they've started to pick up talks again, but they're already, a month past the January 15th deadline when they were supposed to sort of send their agreement officially to Congress. So then they could pick it up, as I was saying, and actually make this legislation I was talking about, the reauthorization. But they're a month past that. It's not clear, last time I've gotten reporting from it, which I've, been talking to people involved in the negotiations. They were still like $1 billion apart in how much, industry was willing to pay versus what FDA wanted in terms of user fees. And there's a lot of sort of details around that. So, and once they do put it out, I get a package together. They're still going to have to wait a month to get public comment, have a meeting. So we're looking, it is a delay. And at the end of the day, even with all that, I think it's still, I would anticipate, and I think most people anticipate that there will be an agreement. They're gonna do it. Nobody wants there to be no agreement. And it's just a matter of the timing. And, technically they do have, as I said, till September 30th. Congress has until September 30th. So, it is enough time. It still is enough time at this point. If we're talking another month, 2 months, we still haven't gotten anything out public, then I'm starting to get worried. So, there's going to be something likely. It's just more a matter of, okay, now what happens? There's going to be a shortened amount of time. Congress already has the drug, biologic, the generics deals. They already had a hearing on those. Devices are missing in action. So it's just a matter of, does this feel rushed? Does that make it less likely that they, let's say, add on, I mentioned this possibility of adding on these bigger reforms, some which people see as a big priority, things like the diagnostics reform or the MSET, which is a high priority for industry. Is it less likely you get these add-ons because there's just less time and less ability to legislate in the amount of time they have? And also, I think FDA has complained a little bit about they don't have an agreement. Usually once they have an agreement, they could start planning. They could start using money they have left over from the current program to say, okay, we're gonna transition. We could do all these things, but because they don't have the agreement yet, they can't do that. So it's gonna cause a rush in transition. So it's still a wait and see. It's not like a catastrophe, not gonna happen sort of situation. But it's more touch and go than I think people want it to be, and particularly because everything got delayed at the beginning with the pandemic, and so it's just it's been a tough go. But the impact still remains to be seen. But I still think we're going to get a user fee deal at some point.
One question I think worth discussing, I know at least what I hear is that we're going into an off-year election cycle, and since we're talking about Congress, probably would be remiss if we didn't at least raise that possibility. Now, I think it's fair to say MedTech usually kind of flies a little under the radar. So whereas you see issues like prescription drug pricing showing up, periodically on the radar screen of candidates, MedTech usually keeps a little lower profile. But as you said, this is a Medufa year. So you want to look into your crystal ball and see if you think that there'll be any impact as far as either delaying the finalization on Medufa or any other impact as far as the election year goes?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Congress is completely unpredictable. I mean, that's the thing, obviously, even in any year nowadays, because it's just so polarized and so many, don't even have to go into all that. But yes, an election year just makes it that much harder. There's just less time. I mean, people are campaigning and et cetera, and the politics and all that. So yeah, I think from a political standpoint, it's usually, like you say, MedTech and, really innovation policies like, drugs too, when it comes to like things to improve cures for diseases and things like that, usually even in this crazy times, get bipartisan support and usually, are able to bypass some of those political issues, but I think the issue is more like, just practicality and time. Like if time becomes short enough and they don't have enough time to, have that extra hearing or lawmakers to address certain issues, it could impact the type of legislation that the overall, let's say, reauthorization packages includes. And like the ability, to, do things like I said, on the reimbursement side, MSET, that adds complication. It adds extra hearings because you have a different committee involved. So the less time you have combined with the election year, I think it's that practical stuff and less like political getting pulled down. But there's also a possibility of there's always the possibility of safety reforms being come up. There's certainly remains going back a decade. This focus on 510K reforms and a need for more evidence for devices and more and that's still out there too. So that can get mixed in potentially depending on the focus or politics of an individual member of Congress. So it is unpredictable. I think at the end of the day, there'll be a Medufa package that includes the rest of FDA that probably gets passed by the summer or fall. And I think it's possible it could end up being just that. And all this other stuff that we, could happen they just may not be able to get to. But we'll have to see what happens. And, it's just so unpredictable.
Thanks for listening so far. This interview will continue after this short message. Market Pathways is the #1 publication that covers the people, challenges, and opportunities impacting the global medical device regulatory, reimbursement, and policy spheres. MyStrategist.com is your digital home to access all of our coverage and read the latest issue of Market Pathways. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.
As long as we're talking about Congress, it's and you mentioned Caliph's confirmation, and we're recording this February 16th, so this is particularly timely. I think one of the things that I'm hearing from folks in the industry, especially around the need for the new FDA commissioner, and now that Caliph's been confirmed, although obviously not by a very wide vote, not by a very wide margin. The concern among industry is what's going to happen at CDRH. Now, obviously, that's not a position at the same level as the commissioner. But what are you hearing with regard to Jeff Shuren's tenure? Any reason to think that there are going to be changes there? I mean, I think people in the industry really are generally pretty satisfied. Relations between industry and regulators, I would suggest, really haven't been better than they have been over the last decade, or much of the last decade or so. So any word on whether we're going to see a changing of the guard at CDRH?
No, I don't think there's any talk about that right now. I mean, of course, nothing can be predicted for sure, and who knows about timing in general. And obviously, yeah, certainly it's been a tough few years for everybody at FDA. There's certainly been a lot of turnover in the lower ranks as reviewers have struggled with the pandemic and all the pressure there. But no, I mean, I haven't heard anything about Shuren, and I think like your question suggests, Shuren really does, kind of drive matters in terms of device policy at FDA, and really is a recognized and supported force within the FDA, and I don't think that's going to change with Robert Califf coming on board to lead it. He's obviously worked with Jeff before, as he was the commissioner just not that long ago, in 2016, 2017. So, and they've worked together, and he's got a very Robert Califf, knows the industry, the agency, very well, and is I think likely to work hand in hand with the Device Center on their current priorities and support, what they're doing. I don't expect him to have a major impact on their direction, other than, I think the biggest thing the commissioner could do is speed up or slow down things that might be happening just based on the overall priorities of what gets out the door overall. But I think there's an expectation that Dr. Califf is, very focused on innovation and sort of, interesting ways, creative ways of collecting data, which is something that certainly the Device Center is already very focused on in terms of things like real world evidence and the like. So, I don't expect, I think the bigger changes are going to be much more around, you have this user fee package, and that kind of creates a new marching orders once that's there. You have obviously just the pandemic hopefully ending or transitioning away, or how FDA transitions away from that. Those are these big macro challenges that they will be doing no matter what, that will affect the changes at the agency, and whether they'll be able to get back to normal and, all that. So, but I don't think Shuren, I don't have a sense that Shuren's going anywhere, and I have a sense that new Commissioner Califf is going to massively change the direction beyond where it would go otherwise.
And I think it's also worth noting that the concerns that people have, or at least the concerns that people express publicly, you never know what is in the minds of legislators that they don't talk about publicly. The concerns about Dr. Califf were related to relations with the drug industry and other issues that have nothing to do with MedTech. So again, supporting your point that there's really no expectation that Cale's coming on board with any sense of either from himself or pressure from the outside to change things at CDRH.
No, yeah, No, I agree, and I think it'll be interesting to. I mean, certainly interesting to just to watch and see, the subtle the stuff and how he takes control, because it's going to be an interesting time at FDA. But I think more just because, like I said, these bigger issues like a pandemic transition and all that, uh,
Right.
much bigger
Let's
factors.
let's circle back to MSID. You raised that, and I think that's going to be a key issue. I mean, industry, the advantage that it favors in terms of the advantages it provides for patients, particularly again Medicare population getting access to innovative technologies. The way also the advantages it provides to just drive innovation. So there seems to be a lot going for it, but it's gone through a rather odd pathways so far. What do you think the next steps are and the prospects that Congress will actually enact MSID into law?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly whether Congress enacts it into law is definitely a big open question. I wouldn't want to put that, I wouldn't want to say that's likely or not likely. It's kind of we'll have to see. I mean, I think so. Just the background on MSID. I mean, obviously Medicare coverage innovative technology. It was sort of something that just came out not that long ago as an official proposed rule. In 2020. To sort of automatic coverage pathway for FDA designated breakthrough devices, kind of 4 years of automatic coverage. Just you get approved, you get your coverage, which is, a new way of, not something that has been the case for devices in the past. And, it was put out in the prior administration and, and then as we kind of alluded to already, was finalized just at the end of it. And then, over this past year under the Biden administration has just been sort of reversed completely before it became an actual active policy. So, I think that, CMS is working on, maybe some alternatives, maybe some MSET light sort of stuff, which we talk about. But I think on the congressional side, there has been a lot of support, both on, certainly on the Republican and Democratic side, some comments on both sides for this policy, in the direction of supporting innovation and, supporting access to new technologies for Medicare patients. And the idea of like after 4 years, you'd have to hopefully have collected the evidence you need to sort of stay in the coverage for those devices. So I think that there is absolute reason to consider it a possibility that it goes through Congress this year. It's certainly the proposal that's been put through Congress is actually even an enhanced version of what CMS would have had, because it also includes includes all FDA breakthrough devices, including sort of certain types of digital health devices that wouldn't have been able to work well with the CMS plan because they don't have a benefit category, but CMS has some end provisions around that. So it's out there. It's in the Cures 2.0 legislation. It's in separate legislation. It has this potential MDUFA catalyst. So I'd put it as a real possibility, but like we talked about before, the unpredictability of Congress, the election year, fiscal stuff. There's always going to be exactly how much is this going to cost on paper, and also just jurisdictional complications. I'm going to put it at more of a 50-50 in my prediction. I wouldn't want to put overconfidence about that, but it's something that has real potential to go through Congress, I would say.
Well, we've been talking a lot about Congress, and I certainly don't want to shortchange the other branches.
Right.
I mean, FDA has gone through a rough year. I mean, obviously, as has everyone with the pandemic. And I think one of the big questions on the minds of everybody listening to this is what steps can they expect the agency to take going forward to return to some degree of normalcy? And nobody's saying that we're going to flip a switch and suddenly, COVID's going to disappear. But everybody in all sectors of the economy and in all sectors of our personal lives, we're all in the process of trying to return to some degree of what used to be the status quo. So I think, there's the same question of what can we expect at the FDA. So things like review backlog. I mean, you alluded to the fact that there have been, significant losses and changes, at the agency in terms of the time that's, the process has taken. So what do you think we can expect in terms of to address that backlog, whether it's in terms of performance goals, whether it's affects things like, pre-submission meetings. That's obviously something that the industry really values. Is that something that is going to get kind of limited? And just as you look at kind of staff challenges in this kind of transition plan, what do you think the agency is going to look like in terms of working with device sector over the next year?
Yeah, no, I mean, one factor is obviously something not in anybody's control, and that's of course where the pandemic goes. If we're in a positive direction, like it feels like now, that will be helpful. If things the new variant crops up suddenly, that causes FDA and others to have to backtrack and really refocus, then that's gonna change up any comments that one would make now. But in terms of preparation, but yeah, I mean, there's no question. FDA has, they've acknowledged, there is some performance goals under the current user fee program ADUFA 4 that have slid a little bit, and they're not quite going to meet in some cases when it comes to sort of 510K or other reviews. And the bigger thing is just that's been obvious. It's just there's obviously a backlog of reviews that just whether or not they've met the goals or not met the goals. It's just a backlog of submissions that haven't come through. FDA has gotten a lot of devices through, nonetheless, non-COVID stuff. It's been kind of don't want to overstate it, but there's certainly been an impact. They've obviously had to put a lot of eggs in the basket of reviewing emergency use authorizations and these enforcement discretions for COVID. But over the past number of months, they've definitely been transitioning back. I think a lot of the divisions and offices within CDRH are I don't want to say back to normal, but people that were having to be on their emergency, kind of shifted to a different totally products just because they had to attend to those emergencies, are back to their normal jobs. And they are in many of those offices doing pre-submissions when they weren't before. Before FDA was really, for a little while there, they weren't really able to do many of those actual have pre-submission meetings, which are a way to get that input before you do trials, before you do submission about what to expect. But now, they are in a lot of cases, maybe just a little bit longer than typical they're taking, but not too much longer. The big exception here is the diagnostics office, which is still, the most challenged office because of all the COVID diagnostics and having to deal with the Omicron variant and all these tests, responding to it. So there's a lot, they are in a positive trend. They've been adding periodically back these activities like pre-submissions, like attacking the backlog that they weren't able to do before. They recently put out 2 draft guidances that are basically transition guidances in terms of, okay, there's all these emergency use authorizations out there. There's all these enforcement discretions out there. What are we going to do once this emergency is technically over? Are these just going to go away and those companies have to take those products on the market, or they're not going to be compliant anymore? Or, is there sort of a transition plan, which is what they put in this draft guidance. So that's going to be another area, but that is going to be a challenge because it's going to be, there is going to be some time period in which a company wants to keep their test out there that's for COVID out there, and they're going to have to get an actual 510K or something. And the FDA is going to have to review that 510K in addition to the 510K that relates to some surgical procedure that's unrelated. So there's all these extra stuff that's going to be coming for the next few years. So it's going to be a slow transition back. I think, some of it will depend on what happens with this user fee deal. What type of resources do they get? Do they get enough to do what they need to do? And budget from Congress, not just user fees. And, just their staffing levels, their, ability to deal with just basic stuff like more people working remote for the extended period. And does that impact the efficiency of reviews? There's so many factors. I think they're very focused on it, and they have been showing improvements back to normal at various times when the virus has sort of, gone down a bit. They've been able to show some improvements back. But it's really this is going to be a major priority. This is Califf. New Commissioner Califf. This is going to be probably one of his top focuses, is figuring this out, not just for devices, but for the FDA at large.
The other big area that I think we should touch on is CMS. And, I think if we were talking, maybe having this conversation 5-6 years ago, and you were to identify what the biggest challenge for device companies is in terms of the government, people be talking about regulatory concerns with the FDA. The consensus, I think, and tell me if you share this view, seems to be that things have really improved, as I alluded to in the beginning, improved in terms of the relations between FDA and industry, things like transparency, accountability, time frame. And again, this is generally pre-COVID. As you said, there's a lot of caveats in light of the pandemic. And today, I would suggest the number one problem facing device companies is reimbursement. And obviously that puts CMS squarely into the bullseye in terms of the agency with which companies are having the biggest challenges. So let's kind of shift gears, talk a little bit about CMS. We alluded to MCIT, but MCIT really only addresses a small portion of the device community and of the patient community. So let's talk about what's your view of what may happen over the next year under the Biden administration at CMS. CMS historically has been a little bit harder for industry to develop relationships. Some people would refer to it as a bit of a black hole. It seems like there are signs that that CMS is kind of trying to change that pattern. They've adopted things like the Navigator program and trying to, I think, reach out, but they're still very under-resourced. But what do you think we can expect going ahead this year from CMS?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because obviously, I agree with you that MCIT has been a lot of focus on the reimbursement side, but it really, at the end of the day, it only impacts a pretty small proportion of overall devices in terms of those FDA breakthrough devices that are approved. And it's more of it is an important signal though to investors, but in terms of that being around. But for CMS generally, I think it'll be really interesting to watch. 2022, I think is going to be really interesting to just kind of see where CMS is at mindset, kind of get a more solid sense of that. Because obviously, during the Trump administration, one thing that he did see a pretty big focus on sort of MedTech innovation as a sort of top level priority. With proposals like MCIT, but also that's when they added like other more streamlined new technology in patient add-on payments, which are bonus payments for breakthrough devices. They had other sort of, like as you mentioned, the Navigator program, which is something that they created more organizationally, where there's a new office and new sort of helpers, navigators as they're calling, to help innovators, MedTech, or maybe in some cases drug innovators, kind of jump through these sort of historically siloed, coverage, coding, payment steps for reimbursement, and actually hand-holding and helping them through the complications there. So those are all things that were created, the prior 4 years. And it's a little unclear, like, is that going to be where that emphasis will lie over the next 4 years? Obviously, with the repeal of MCIT, that is kind of shows like maybe there's definitely more caution about putting access to innovation forward as opposed to assurances of evidence and knowing where that evidence is coming from and having a good sense of evidence in the Medicare beneficiary population. That seems to be where the biggest caution came from in that repeal from CMS that happened. And that is, kind of could lend itself to other areas. Like, are they still doing this Navigator program that we talked about? It's not very clear. It was a pilot program. I've been, trying to get information from parties on that. It's not so easy. Are they still, kind of putting those types of priorities forward for MedTech versus other things? CMS has a lot of things going on at once. It's a very, it's an agency that does a lot with not tons of money. So where are they putting those priorities? And also, I think a big area. So I think maybe we'll get some information on that in 2022 in terms of how they approach that stuff more broadly, and also within the context of digital health, because reimbursement for digital health is an area that's, kind of on the forefront, a little bit unclear. They're not the same as your typical medical device. A lot of times they don't fit the typical, as I alluded to before, benefit categories. Things like artificial intelligence, how does that work? It kind of changes the dynamic of care and how that fits into what you're valuing certain interactions. So CMS has been really kind of working through those issues for the past few years. And it's possible there could be some incremental policy developments in that area that I think could give us a sense of like how much are they looking at that innovation, of importance of reimbursing for some of these new approaches to healthcare based on technology versus other things. So it's like kind of just a lot of open questions that I think are there about what the current CMS leadership under this administration, kind of how they see MedTech innovation in the context of everything else in terms of healthcare and payment and value and beneficiaries and all that. So it's going to be, I think, in next 2022 and 2023, to really get a real sense of where CMS is at with that stuff.
Thanks for listening, guys. Tune into the next episode to hear Steve and I hit on key 2022 challenges and considerations in Europe and Asia MedTech regulations. In the meantime, head to mystrategist.com, where Market Pathways has in-depth articles and data addressing the global policy environment. And have a great week.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.